pen and pulled out a burlap sack. Inside were 2 hands, 2 feet, 1 head. Belle Gunness was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth on November 11, 1859, in Selbu municipality, Norway, the youngest of 8 children to Paul and Berit Storseth. She was confirmed in the Church of Norway in 1874. At 14 she started working neighboring farms, milking cows and herding cattle, saving toward passage to America. She left Norway in 1881. When immigration officials at Castle Garden processed her, they wrote her first name down as Belle, and it stuck. She joined her sister Nellie in Chicago, worked as a domestic servant, and later took a job at a butcher's shop, cutting up animal carcasses. She was a big woman for her era, at least 5'7", somewhere between 209 and 249 pounds, and by every account physically strong. In 1884 she married Mads Ditlev Anton Svensson. The couple ran a candy store in Chicago that eventually burned to the ground. Their home burned too. Both fires produced insurance payouts. During this period, 2 infants in the Svensson household died, their deaths recorded as inflammation of the large intestine. Belle had taken out insurance policies on both children and collected on them after they died. Neighbors talked, mostly because no one had ever noticed Belle pregnant. Svensson himself held 2 life insurance policies, timed so that on July 30, 1900, one policy was expiring the same day the other took effect. That was the day he died, of what was ruled a cerebral hemorrhage. Belle's account was that he'd come home complaining of a headache, she'd given him a dose of quinine powder, and when she checked on him later he was gone. The coincidence of the 2 policies drew attention, but the cause of death on record remained hemorrhage, not poison. She collected on both policies and used the money to buy a pig farm in LaPorte, Indiana. She married again in 1902, to Peter Gunness. Within a week, his infant daughter died in Belle's care, cause unrecorded. 8 months later, Peter himself died of a skull injury. Belle said a meat grinder had fallen from a high shelf onto his head while he reached for something nearby. A coroner's jury was convened, suspicious enough to investigate a possible murder, but the inquiry went nowhere. She collected $3,000 in insurance. By 1905, Belle was placing marriage advertisements in Chicago newspapers, and men began arriving at her Indiana farm carrying savings, land deeds, and expectations of a wife. Henry Gerhold, a Wisconsin farmhand, answered one of the ads and moved to LaPorte. He wrote home that he liked the place, that his health was good, and asked his family to mail him seed potatoes. Then the letters stopped. When his family wrote to Belle asking after him, she told them he'd run off to Chicago with a group of horse traders. His trunk and fur overcoat stayed behind in her house. In 1906, a Minnesota farmer named John Moe answered one of the same ads. He and Belle corresponded for months before he traveled to LaPorte, withdrawing a large sum of cash before he went. No one saw him again. A carpenter who did odd jobs on the property later mentioned, almost in passing, that Moe's trunk was still sitting in Belle's house, alongside more than a dozen others just like it. The case broke open in April 1908, when the Gunness farmhouse burned to the ground. In the wreckage, searchers found the body of a headless adult woman and the bodies of Belle's 3 children. The woman was initially identified as Belle herself. But the fire had only started the digging. Investigators went on to unearth the partial remains of at least 11 more people scattered across the property. Among the identified was Jenny Olson, a young woman Belle had told neighbors had moved to Los Angeles. The coroner was confident enough in the identification to issue a death certificate for her right there in LaPorte. The case widened further when Axel Helgelien contacted LaPorte police. He had letters between his brother, Andrew Helgelien, and Belle, letters asking Andrew to come to LaPorte, to bring money, and to tell no one where he was going. Axel traveled to the farm with a former hired hand and noticed odd, sunken patches of earth in what had once been the hog pen. Digging into one, they found a gunny sack. Inside were 2 hands, 2 feet, and a head. Axel recognized them as his brothers. Once investigators started looking, they found the yard pockmarked with dozens of these same slump depressions. Sack after sack came up out of the ground, torsos, arms hacked off at the shoulder, legs severed at the knee, skulls separated and marked with blunt trauma and gashes. Every body had been cut apart the same way. 5 sets of remains came up on the first day of digging, 6 more the next, some under the old hog pen, others near the outhouse or down by the lake. At some point, the source material notes, the police simply stopped counting. Coverage of the case drew inquiries from families across the country whose men had vanished after answering personal ads. Most of the remains, in the end, were never identified. The story didn't end with the graves. Ray Lamphy, Belle's hired hand and sometime lover, was arrested and in November 1908 convicted of arson for setting the fire that destroyed the farmhouse. He later gave a confession describing how Belle had placed the advertisements, lured men to the farm, and robbed them, and he said she had asked him to burn the house down with her own children still inside it. Lamphy also claimed the headless body pulled from the ruins wasn't Belle at all, but another victim, deliberately chosen and placed there to throw investigators off. According to him, Belle had learned that the brother of one missing man intended to come to Larport and start asking questions, and that warning was what pushed her to destroy the house and disappear rather than face him. When Lamphy was arrested, he was wearing John Moe's overcoat and Henry Gerhold's watch. A second, inconsistent version of Lamphy's confession surfaced later, given privately to a Methodist minister, Reverend Edwin Shell, who wrote it down, had Lamphy sign it, and locked it away. A journalist named Edward Beckley eventually got hold of it and published it, an act that led to the arrest of an accomplice, Elizabeth Smith. The identity of the headless body became its own puzzle. 3 rings were found on its charred hand, 2 gold bands and 1 set with a diamond, a ring Belle's first husband had supposedly given her on their wedding day. That seemed damning, until investigators pointed out that a woman as calculating as Belle could just as easily have placed her own rings on someone else's hand to sell the illusion. Dr. Harry Long, a Larport physician who had known Belle personally, was blunt about it in early May. The body weighed about 160 pounds against Belle's 325 or more, stood nearly 5 inches shorter, had smoothly rounded arms unlike hers, and had neatly manicured fingernails, something Belle was never known to bother with. "It is not that of Mrs. Gunness," he said. "I am sure of that." Against that, Belle's dentist identified a gold crown found in the debris as one he'd placed in her mouth himself, and some investigators treated that as the final word. Nobody ever explained what had happened to the head. Whether Belle Gunness burned in that house or walked away from it has never been settled. The Larport sheriff blamed a Chicago newspaper reporter for inventing the story that she'd escaped, but reported sightings of her around Chicago kept surfacing long after she'd been declared legally dead. In 2008, 100 years after the fire, investigators tried running DNA tests on the headless corpse, comparing it against a sample pulled from a letter Belle had once written to one of her victims. The sample was too degraded to yield an answer. Once news of the farm spread, Larport became a destination. People traveled from across the country to walk the property where the graves had been dug, and vendors sold souvenirs and concessions to the crowds who came to look at the ground. She has stayed a fixture of American true crime storytelling since, the subject of Murder Ballads, a chapter in Stuart Holbrook's 1941 book on true crime, a 2018 non-fiction account by Harold Schechter, novels, films, and a podcast episode retelling her story to new audiences. What's never been resolved is the simplest question of all, whose body actually burned in that farmhouse in April of 1908. Somewhere in Larport, that headless corpse still doesn't have a confirmed name.